Welcome to Truth and Transcendence. You can find all our other episodes on truthandtranscendence.com. I'm delighted today to welcome special guest Jamie Ryder, who's here today to talk about his amazing book, History's Greatest Philosophers, but also various other very interesting themes that we talked about when we met for the prequel. Jamie is a mental health advocate. He grew up in Manchester in the UK with a comic book in one hand and a Stoic quote in the other. Now he writes stealth help books, which I'm going to ask him what that means, where ancient wisdom and battles meet pop culture and personal growth lessons. Because, as Jamie said, self-improvement is more fun with a few fight scenes. His latest book is History's Greatest Philosophers, Classical Wisdom for Modern Times. The book will help you apply practical philosophy to build better mindset and mental health habits. And I've got the book behind me. If you're watching this on video, you can see the book, and I've read it. And I will just say, it's a very interesting and unique approach to talking about philosophy, because Jamie really dives into the lives and the lifetimes and the events of the day for each philosopher, which makes a much, much richer picture than, right, here's their philosophy, this is how the philosophy works, these are the theories, this is who else said it. It's a much more interesting, rich and human journey. So if you're interested in understanding philosophy in a human way, I really recommend this book, and I am going to put the Amazon link in the show notes. You can find Jamie at jamieryderbooks.com, and that's JAMIERYDER books.com, and all his books are on there. He's got other amazing books as well that he's already written. So, Jamie, without further ado, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Catherine, in that great intro. I think that's a great starting point to go on. What does humanity mean in philosophy? And that's a huge topic to really dive into, I'm sure.
Well, why don't you just dive into that then? What is humanity in philosophy, given you just raised that immediately? What's your take on that?
Well, that's the thing about philosophy. It always opens up more questions. There's a question beneath the question. And for me, that was the starting point of where I really enjoy philosophy. Now, going back quite a number of years, I first came to that topic from an academic standpoint, where I looked at it from studying it in high school, and I thought, yeah, these ideas, they seem interesting, but I don't really know as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old how they can actually be applied to the modern world. And I thought it was quite a high-minded approach, which I find a lot of people coming to philosophy might have that initial interpretation of it. It was only until many years later during the pandemic that I found the practical applications of it, and the humanity of philosophy was these are real life issues that people from all walks of life have been through. It's a universal struggle of ideas that people can find out of multiple schools of thought, and how you apply those lessons will apply to completely different walks of life. But at least for me, during the pandemic, that was when the shift started to occur, to see a practical form of it, particularly through the aspect of the school of thought of Stoicism.
Yes, because the school of thought Stoicism, as I learned in your book, provides some foundation to a lot of the later approaches, doesn't it?
Of course. And for me, Stoicism was that initial gateway drug. Yeah, let's call it a gateway drug, because there's lots of different schools of thought out there. But from going through lockdown, I was isolated from my friends and family, like a lot of us were at the time. And that's when I really needed to make sense of the world. And I did come across the philosophy of Stoicism through various books and podcasts. And it really struck me, that core idea of we can only focus on what we can control and what we can't control. And from that British mentality, growing up, I was always taught that little less stoic trait of, oh, you've got to keep a stiff upper lip as a British man. You can't really talk about your feelings. And it's that robotic idea of being emotionless. But when I realized that big S stoicism, the philosophy, is actually the complete opposite, that was a light bulb moment for me. And it really is being able to regulate your emotions, still being able to feel things like anxiety, fear, and all of that. But you don't have to be controlled by them. You can acknowledge them, and it's certainly important to feel them, but you can still find ways to live with them and still be active in your community, still be active in multiple ways that make sense to you. And I thought, wow, there's so much depth there, and it really started me along that journey of trying to pick apart other philosophies and take them as I went.
Yes, yeah. It's a very interesting thing, isn't it? How the philosophy has an awful lot of depth to it, and yet there comes a point in time where everyone thinks they know what it is, and they've got a very simplistic idea of what they think it is. Do you have any insight into how or why that happens?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there's multiple strands to look at that. I mean, from a simplicity point of view, I think the paradox of philosophy is it's so deeply complicated, but also so simple at the same time. And what I look at from that simplicity point of view, let's just take Stoicism as an example. That core truth is you can control what you can control and you can't control what you can't control. That's a good leading point to start from the practical point of view. But of course, in that school of thought, there's lots of theoretical exercises and things between logic and reason and how all of these ancient philosophers started to put that together. Now, that's all very interesting and theoretical, but I like to focus on the simplicity of the down-to-earth practicalities of it because I find that has more real life applications, such as a technique called the premeditation of adversity from a mental health point of view. Now, this was coined by the philosopher Seneca, who was trying to focus on real life scenarios where there'll always be scenarios where we go in there with the worst case, but how can we practice for those? How can we inoculate ourselves to the stress of those moments? And what he was doing was saying, if you try to rehearse a specific situation in your mind and you imagine what the worst case scenario would be, you don't really have to focus on a result. If you're trying to plan for a certain event, then yes, the worst may still happen. But if you can lay the groundwork beforehand and actually do that multiple times, then perhaps by the time you come to that event, then you'll be inoculated to whatever stress you are, and the outcome is not the point of it. So by doing that practical exercise, the premeditation of adversity, I find that's the best way to actually look at philosophy generally. It's like, what techniques, what mentalities can you apply to your ever shifting world to be able to make sense of all the complexities that come out through life? Whereas if you're talking about a bunch of abstract or theoretical concepts, then yes, there's still some value to that, but how often are you going to really apply those abstract theoretical theories if you don't understand the groundwork of how they mean to you, but also how you can help other people in your immediate circle as well?
Yes. And what you're talking about there is actually engaging personally with it rather than just only engaging with it in a kind of mental, how do I pigeonhole this as simply as possible and then think I know what it's about. And in fact, one of the philosophers you spoke about was very much into that thing of I don't know, and I'm not even sure about that. What's the actual quote?
Oh yeah, I think you might be talking about Michel de Montaigne there, the French philosopher. He was fascinating and he invented the essay genre. And I'm just going to paraphrase because he was actually paraphrasing from Socrates. But essentially what that is the only thing I don't know is that I don't know. And I'm not even sure of that. It's questioning the question essentially. And what I love about Montaigne specifically, he was a very human and a very funny writer and philosopher who didn't want to just look at a bunch of high-minded ideas. He really set out to write his essays to understand himself. And what was fascinating was he was doing something that had never been seen at the time, where he was investigating even the small minutiae of his days, down to his bodily movements, to politics. And a lot of people had a lot of opinions about him even to this day, but without his complete body of work, then essays as we know them today would never have been invented. The glut of information that we find on the internet with all this content that's coming out as well, I think we can bring it back to him as well. But by doing that explorative form of writing, that was a philosophical exercise in itself. And to be able to examine your own mind, but your own mind in relation to everybody else around you, that's a very valuable practical exercise as well that Montaigne introduced to the world.
Yeah, yeah. And there was something you spoke to me about on the pre-call about being a wisdom scavenger. I think you described yourself as a wisdom scavenger. Would you like to share what that means and what that means to you?
Of course, yeah. So I've thought really long and hard about how wisdom scavenging looks. And for me, it is that idea of you can just cherry pick different ideas that make sense to you. So I said that Stoicism was the first philosophy that really became my gateway drug. But it's like, okay, what else is out there? What actually makes sense to me? And I think it's important to say that somebody can still be Stoic, but they can still enjoy things like Eastern philosophies as well, rather than just being pigeonholed as one thing. If one strand of thought makes sense to you, then absolutely lean into it. But for me, I love investigating multiple forms of cultures and different ideas, and it is scavenging for the wisdom in that one school of thought that makes sense to me today. So is the Stoic piece that I can take from? Is there an Epicurean piece? Is there a skeptic piece I can take from if I'm feeling in a certain way? But how can I apply that to other people as well? So if you have a 360-degree view of different cultures or ideas that you can pick from, I find that you can broaden your horizons in a much more holistic way rather than just necessarily sticking to one doctrine, because there's more ways that you can be flexible with other forms of thought, I find.
Yeah. And, some people listening might think, oh my God, that sounds like a lot of work. So for you, did this actually feel like a lot of work, or was it enjoyable and fun for you?
Oh, well, it was very enjoyable and fun. And I will take your point to say that, yes, having all of this information out there can be overwhelming sometimes. And I find trying to pin down a specific idea or philosophical path that might make sense to you in the moment is a great way to follow along that path and to see where it takes you. You might come across similar ideas in other thoughts, but with the book in particular, I was very interested in laying the groundwork for all of the foundations of perhaps the most easily recognizable schools of thought that have been out there. And we've spoken about this briefly on the prequel, but I did set out to write this in a sequential order to say, yes, here are things that I think you can follow along the path, but you don't necessarily have to. If you find there's something more interesting about the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, start there. Or maybe you are interested in the school of thought of absurdism with Albert Camus. Here's everything about existentialism and absurdism. Follow your path there. It might always bring you back to the same ideas, but how those ideas are packaged and always delivered are always different and informed by the person who was living at that time, which is where the book style comes in.
Yes. And it's interesting, as you're talking, that kind of way of exploring that you're describing really reminds me of the actual philosophers in the book, in the way you describe them, that they followed the thing that interested them. And they might meet someone in the marketplace and become their pupil or become their teacher, and they just seem to be just following what was of interest to them and seemed to matter to them. And that's very interesting as well, because I think sometimes when we think about bodies of material, particularly ancient information, I think sometimes we think we have to explore it in a linear fashion. Like if we're cramming for an exam, you've got to learn topics 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in that order, because you're going to be tested on it. But the way you speak is completely the opposite of that. It's a much more organic feel to it.
Absolutely, and that brings me more in mind of Eastern philosophies, for example. So what I think is interesting to point out is I think there's a few key differentiators between what I look as Western philosophy versus Eastern philosophy. And with the West, I think it's really interesting to look at it from a regimented point of view, to say, here's a list of principles and logical exercises that, yes, can make sense. And if you need to be regimented in your day, then you can follow these list of practices and maybe it'll help, maybe it won't. Whereas with things like Taoism, or looking at things from a more Japanese point of view, I find there's less of a fixed direction. It's more going with the flow and being flexible. And I find that's a really good way to look at it, at least for me. I do like to be flexible with my mode of thinking sometimes when I need to say, I'll suspend my judgment for a certain point of view to say, let me weigh up multiple paths, and then I'll come back and think, here's my informed decision now. So by leaning more into Eastern philosophy, I find that's a better way to help me get to that point. Whereas Western philosophies are great if you do need that staccato kind of, yes, this will help, this will help, this will help, but it always just applies to that person or situation.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Another topic I was really interested in that you spoke about was absurdism, and Albert Camus. Would you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I go into what I like is the funny side of philosophy now. I mentioned Montaigne briefly, but here's Camus, somebody who I think is a wonderful human example of a philosopher who lived and breathed his philosophy. And in the book, on the chapter about Camus, I actually start it with whoever's watching. If you've not watched Monty Python, then I would absolutely recommend it. But the Holy Grail from Monty Python, and there's a great skit in that where there's the Black Knight fighting King Arthur, and the whole point of that situation is the Black Knight thinks he's invincible, and King Arthur, within a couple of minutes, chops his arms and his legs off, but he still is fighting. He still thinks he can beat King Arthur. Now, that situation is inherently absurd, and the point of view is that the Black Knight is so delusional that he still thinks he can win. And that is a great example of absurd comedy, but that is a great strand to actually start to understand the philosophy of absurdism, simply because to actually believe that is absurd but also deeply human. The Black Knight finds meaning in that act of throwing himself against the inevitable. And I think if Albert Camus had been alive to watch Monty Python skits, I think he would get a great kick out of that. But Albert Camus really is an interesting writer and a philosopher because he was always focused on trying to find meaning in the absurdity and the mundanity of things. And one of the most famous examples that I can think of that is really distilled down is called the myth of Sisyphus, where Camus wrote about the idea that the Greek tragic hero Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for the rest of his life. Now, people might think that, oh, I've got to roll a boulder up the life, whether it's a job that I don't like, whether it's a situation that I'm resigned to forever, this is monotonous, I can't escape it. But Camus was saying that in the act of rolling that boulder up a hill and it rolling back down every day, we can inherently find meaning in that act. And I think there's something wonderful about acknowledging that in any situation across your life, you're still going to find something where you have no choice but to do it, but you can make the conscious choice to actually enjoy that and find amazing purpose out of it. And certainly over the past few years, I've found myself leaning into that absurdist approach because to be human is inherently, at least for me, to be absurd, and also to actually drum it down to that point of view is really interesting. What was also interesting for Camus about me was the fact that he always tended to write in cycles. So he tended to write a novel, an essay, and a play through different cycles. So he had the cycle of the absurd, where he first wanted to focus on alienation and the meaningless of existence through novels like The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus. He also had his cycle of revolt, where he wrote the novel The Plague, his essay The Rebel, and the play Just Assassins, where he was about trying to find meaning and revolt against those initial absurd points of view. And I think, at least for me, what can be actually quite useful is to actually look at these different cycles from how you apply them to your life. So what I've tried to do recently is, how can I do an absurd act today? How can I do an act of revolt? And how can I do an act of love, which was Camus' final cycle, his cycle of love, which he unfortunately didn't get to complete because he died beforehand. But something for me is a cycle of the absurd might be, how can I do something unexpected in my day? How can I really try to shock myself awake from something? A cycle of revolt, how could I revolt against something that might be an unhelpful thought pattern or something that I've never tried to do before? Or finally, how could I do an act of love, whether it's an act of self-love, or how could I do an act for a friend or somebody in my immediate circle? And I found thinking that way has been really purposeful in how I show up day to day.
How beautiful. I love that. It's a very, very nice. I mean, even if people just took that. So the first one was, it was absurd, revolt, and love.
Indeed, yeah. And I find for whatever reasons, people are very hardwired to think three of things. Camus did it. A lot of other philosophers did it as well. I thought, yeah, if it's throughout the week, how could you do something potentially absurd, whether it's unexpected? Could you revolt against an unhelpful thought pattern or an injustice or something small or political? It doesn't really matter what it is. And finally, an act of love that would be resonant for you or for somebody else.
No, probably both, actually, if it's proper act of love. How wonderful. I think that's absolutely fascinating. So you said that it was during the pandemic that you really started exploring this in much more depth as a response to what you were dealing with at that time. And you said that it really, really helped you. How did it help you? You know, if someone's listening to this and thinking, oh, yeah, I was having a really shitty time in the lockdown as well. How did this actually help Jamie to kind of navigate that?
Of course. So I find what it really helped me first to was just put myself in a completely different headspace, because being trapped inside was just not great for just having nobody to talk to. But of course, by leaning into Stoic principles such as the premeditation of adversity that I mentioned earlier, or other things like the view from above, where it's taking a big picture view of your current circumstances and really aligning yourself with maybe other people in your city or the rest of the world to put yourself on that same level, it really made me step back and think, yes, the situation that I'm in was not ideal, but there are still ways that I can find meaning, or I can still do small things. And it was a very case of saying one act per day or one thing moving forward. If I could get a journal and start writing down things that were positive or things that I would do better, it was starting to galvanize me to do that. So I find that practical form of philosophy is really useful to start building momentum with small acts rather than thinking you've got to do everything at once. Or with things like Eastern philosophies as well, I find that being able to go with the flow more can take the pressure off myself when I'm in a high stress situation where I'm thinking, yes, things might still not go to plan, but why am I trying to fight so hard against this current, this metaphorical current? What if I just take a step back and just lean into it rather than trying to force myself through it? I find that's a good method of thinking as well. Now, obviously, there'll be times when I still fall back into old patterns. I should say philosophy is not a cure-all, and it's not something that will work for everybody. But for me, it's good to have this toolkit that I can use to become more self-aware and dip into it if I need it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well done. I think that's an intelligent response to the situation. I think, you know, there was apparently the consumption of alcohol went through the roof in the UK during the pandemic, which is perhaps a slightly less intelligent response to the situation. Not to suggest that you didn't take a drink at all during that period, but still, it sounds like what you did is quite a creative thing. And you also are a mental health advocate. So would you say a bit more about that? And does that link back to this journey with philosophy?
Of course, yes. So, in terms of looking at it from that male mental health point of view, I find philosophy is a great way to explain certain concepts that might actually ring true, particularly if we look at that idea of what different forms of stoicism can be, because a lot of British men certainly might have looked at that point of view of emotionless, robotic. Being a stoic character is inherently some kind of strength, whereas if you explain that the actual philosophy of Stoicism is actually imparting the knowledge to be able to talk openly about how you're feeling, but still being able to regulate what you're feeling. It's logical, but it's also deeply emotional as well. I find from a male point of view, that is easier to kind of get that message across. Or talking about other kinds of ideas is still important to say, look back at all of this wisdom from 2000 years ago. This is still very important even today, but it's important to try to find these ideas that will actually resonate with the particular audience. And I find by talking about it, that's a great way to make people think differently. And like, but look at all this stuff here as well. And that certainly leads into what I deem as stealth help, my genre, which is self-development is a huge genre. There's lots of stuff out there, but sometimes that might come across as preachy, whether well-intentioned or not. And certainly people can respond to that if that's what they need. But I find stealth help for me can incorporate other things. It's storytelling, mythology, pop culture. It's putting the reader in the headspace of the character on the page, which is how I approach the writing of the philosophers, to say these were real life characters who are living in the present moment where their thoughts are all over the place. They're dealing with chaotic and complex situations. So how are they applying what they were learning at the time in that moment? And that's the writing approach I took, to say, rather than these prescriptive ideas, let's look at these people in context in their moment, and the ideas will come out naturally through the way their stories are told. And if people think, huh, these ideas are interesting, now I want to actually go and investigate them myself, then that is certainly vindicating for me. That is where self-help, I find, is that gentle guide, not to preach, but to offer a gentle path forward for people who want to explore all of these different paths.
I think it's brilliant, and some of the lives these people were living and what was happening in the world around them was absolutely brutal. I mean, people in exile thinking, if I put a foot wrong, they're going to send a team of assassins for me. And that was just normal. And there was even, with Macchiavelli, I think it was Macchiavelli, where he was studying with somebody and apparently this person routinely sexually abused his students. And I think in the book you said this was considered to be just a standard part of the process for young men when they're learning in academia, that you're going to get abused by your tutor. It's just it just comes with the turf. And I thought that is absolutely brutal. And yet these people were living through it and generating this incredible wisdom while they were doing it. I think that's an incredible reminder for us today, because I think a lot of us moan and whinge about stuff that's nowhere near as bad as what some of these people were going through.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's important to note that it's all relative, isn't it? What is 2,000 years ago, 100, doesn't really matter. The context of the time, it was far more brutal from a physical and a mental state from a certain point of view. But inherently human is to still feel that deep sense of fear and unknown and alienation. And the external circumstances are very different, but internally we're all still hardwired the same. And philosophy for me is that great leveler. It really doesn't matter what part of life you're from or what you've gone through. If you imbibe certain ideas, then I think it's a great panacea against the blows of fate, to put on my Machiavellian hat, for an example, because those kind of things that you just alluded to really shaped his really pragmatic point of view of the world, which I think gets conflated sometimes with that idea that ends do justify the means. But modern Machiavellianism, I think, can still be very different from his version of Machiavellianism, because the times were completely different. And sometimes you do have to be that pragmatic person to actually try to change your fate. And I think that's acceptable in certain circumstances, others not. But that lends back to that very nuanced and complex version of what different philosophies can lend to.
Absolutely. And he was very, very smart as well. I think sometimes people don't distinguish between being strategically very smart and being selfishly manipulating. I think often people think those two things always go together, which they don't necessarily, do they?
No, absolutely not. And I think that's a very apt distinction between what I look at as modern Machiavellianism. There's the political Machiavellianism, which is what everybody expects it to be, versus that very human-centric, pragmatic, strategic point of view where you've just got to make some kind of decision, but you look at different points of view to be able to be pragmatic, essentially.
Yeah. So obviously, I'm guessing that working with all of this and writing the book was quite an experience for you. Am I right about that?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you look at it, it's, juggling multiple points of view and different philosophies and really trying to put myself in the shoes of these great men and women who have lived far more interesting and complex lives than I would ever be able to. But in terms of how I approached that, it was just saying, look, they're flawed, they're not perfect. They've gone through their whole different multitude of errors and what they've experienced, but they've still got those core truths that people can relate to. And that's the most fun part of the book that I really found writing these characters. It was to say, yes, I can relate to them in certain ways, and that's the way I actually started reading and writing them. But there are other things that I discovered about them that have not have any applicable to my point of view at all, but it's still great to learn. And that's the point of view of being a philosopher. I find the idea is philosophers are people who love wisdom, and I find that's a great distinction between what I look as knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is what you pick up, wisdom is what you actively apply and still try to get better at consistently, and that is the hard part. That is philosophy in its essence.
Yeah, beautiful. So then you came through the the lockdowns and everything and out the other side, and you've written this book. How has what you're now doing evolved from that, and what you're doing with this information? How has that evolved, or has your life changed, particularly in terms of what you're doing as a result of doing that work?
I find from a personal standpoint, it's really helped me become far more self-aware and around my immediate changing circumstances. I am a recent first-time dad, and as you can imagine, philosophy certainly helps with a rambunctious, almost one-year-old daughter who's brand new and alive to the world and everything's going on. And sometimes it is to say I'm juggling multiple plates and I can't always be present as I'd like to be. And it's easy to fall into the trap of trying to make snap decisions or being overly emotional when I don't mean to be. But I've got all of these techniques around me that can be that leveler and make me think, hang on, Jamie, you are inherently doing something wrong here. It's nobody's fault. But by having that self-awareness in the back of my mind, by looking at it through stoicism, skepticism, or whatever strand of thought I'm thinking about at that time, it is good to reset myself and think about how I can show up to be a better parent and to be able to guide my daughter Freya along a path as she goes older that I hope will make her as curious and open to new ideas as I try to be in my life.
Yeah. And is your partner also equally curious, or does she think you're a bit of a nutter for doing this?
Oh, absolute nutter. Yeah, absolute. And I'll give her that. But I find that makes our relationship a lot more interesting because sometimes we can be very opposite. Sometimes we can be very aligned with things. But really, I think she's far more philosophical than I think she thinks she is. It's just how she's gone through her life with vastly different experiences, and still the ideas penetrate. It's just not saying, oh, you were doing something quite philosophical today. It's no, you're just being you. And I think that's the great way it is. People do a lot of stoic things and they might not think they're doing it, but that is just them making that decision. And I think that's wonderful. If you can get to a place in your life where you're saying, I'm actually studying, I'm actually doing something philosophical here. If you don't even have that thought to say, I'm just doing things, I think that's where the great shift occurs. And certainly for me, I start thinking, here's a philosophical exercise I'm going to do today, where now it's got to a point of just saying, no, I'm doing this thing now as I'm doing it. I don't think it's philosophical. It's just how I show up in the day. And that's the growth I've certainly seen from myself along this journey.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. And because I was also thinking about how often we'll just in common life, we'll say something or have a particular behavior or a particular thought form that actually, if someone reads your book, they can recognize where that may have originally come from. And we just don't realize it. I think that's very useful because it means that we can realize we may be doing something that really works for us consciously, or we may just be copying something unconsciously. And we can then question, does it actually work for us? And if it does, we can double down. And if it doesn't, we can shift it.
Oh, absolutely. And just along that strand of thought, because questions with more questions, I think that's a great way to look at the philosophy of skepticism. Going back to Montaigne, for example, his favorite philosophy of all was skepticism, i.e., being able to juggle multiple viewpoints and say, I am literally going to suspend my judgment with questions and actually weigh this up until I can make my informed decision. And I think that's a very healthy way to look at the world, specifically in this era where there's a lot of information out there and people are very polarized in politics or across multiple spectrums of life. If you actually can withhold your judgment around certain things and actually try to see more than one side, whether it's republicanism, Democrats, just to take that example, perhaps you could actually become a more rounded person by being able to understand that person. You don't have to agree with them, you can tolerate them, but at least you actually try to understand them as a human being and actually get to where you are. And that was certainly very useful for Montaigne in his era, where it was highly politically charged and he had to navigate through a lot of complex relationships.
Yes, and he actually had relationships with people with all sorts of different points of view, didn't he?
Oh yeah, and his job at the time was in Parliament. I think he started by writing down the opinions of people in court to actually try to make these decisions. And ironically, he ended up becoming the mayor of that same municipality where he couldn't do the theory anymore. He actually had to make those decisions for people. So I think that's a great journey for where he came, and that really informed his essays as well for how he got to that point.
Yeah, but he wasn't necessarily thrilled about being made mayor, was he?
Well, that's that again. That's quite complex. Some people say that he wanted it. Some people said he couldn't think of anything worse. And I think that again, looking at how philosophy and ideas change, everybody has their own interpretations as the years go by. Montaigne originally just wanted to write to understand himself. It's not as if he tried to publish anything for his own kind of viewpoint to actually be commercial, although that was great that he did. Whereas about 200, 300 years later, the Romantics thought that he wasn't being deep enough. People thought he was a menace to society because he had all of these controversial opinions. Whereas now, my opinion is that if he was alive today, then he'd be writing all kinds of blogs. He'd be on Reddit. It'd be like looking at all these different things. So everybody has their own interpretations. And I think that's the beauty of philosophy as well, that it is open to change. It has to evolve from those original ideas, but you can still be traditional if that applies to you.
Yeah. So will there be more books? Because, a couple of philosophers who I am aware of were not mentioned in the book, such as, for example, Sartre or Nietzsche. I never know how to pronounce that name properly. So will you be doing, a sequel book with talking about more philosophers, or is this cycle complete and you're moving on to something else now?
Well, never say never. To take the Camus approach, I did have the cycle in mind to say I've got these 3 books from different cultures that I wanted to start with this series that I call Wisdom Traditions of the World, but there's always new ideas. I'm always evolving as a writer, and I would love to go back to other philosophers in the future, whether it's on an individual level or from a bigger book, maybe a biography of just one philosopher. That's a great goal to set for myself. Now, where that comes from, I don't know. But for now, this cycle is complete, and I'm just looking forward to seeing if it helps anybody in the future.
Fantastic. Can people actually have conversations with you about philosophy, or are you, um, not available for that? I mean, what's your kind of view about that?
Oh, interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I would always say that I'm very open to debating people around certain ideas and learning about what their point of view is. And if people would like to discuss anything like that, you can just get in touch with me through my website to ask any questions.
Fantastic. Brilliant. So I'm just checking my notes to see if there's anything else that I would just kick myself if I didn't ask you about. Yeah, the stealth help thing I think was very interesting, and you've talked about that a little bit. Is there anything else about that you would like to share with listeners?
I would just like to caveat the actual distinction again between self-help and stealth-help to really hone the point. Stealth-help for me is that slow guide where you can actually say the storytelling and the ancient wisdom is there, whereas that can work for some people. Self-help is what it is. It is more of a preaching point of view that I think can work for people, or people might not necessarily respond to that. But there are multiple paths within this wider genre of trying to find ideas that help people, and I'm all for it. I don't think there's one thing that's right or wrong. I just think it's what people most respond to based on their circumstances.
Yeah, brilliant. And I really wanted to pick up on something you said in relation to that, in relation to men in particular, and that you had realized that what men need is different from what women need, perhaps, in terms of their entry point into exploring some of these things. And as a man yourself, you'd explored that in yourself, recognized it, and then fed that into how you wrote the book. And I thought that was very interesting and inspired, or that was very inspired. Because I do think a lot of men, if they think about investing in their well-being or their self-awareness, are just faced with a lot of stuff which is really designed for women and doesn't necessarily resonate or support them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, we're all well intentioned, and in an ideal world, I would love that the same ideas should apply to women and men. And I think we're all in the same boat. I just think sometimes it goes back to how that message is delivered, particularly from different generations. Now, I'm a millennial in my 30s, where we were raised to be very much more emotionally aware. And I think that's a great thing. But maybe people from a boomer generation or older, for example, obviously the way they grew up was very different, and that can still be quite difficult for them to open up to things. Whereas if it might be explained in a philosophical way, perhaps that can be a better entry point for them. But I'm glad to see that over the past decade, there's definitely been a lot more openness to mental health education for men and women, and it's always growing, which is great. There's still obviously just a lot more work to be done, and if this work is a small node in that wider lattice of helping anybody, then that is why I set out to write the book, ultimately, to share that honest mental health point of view, but through philosophy.
Beautiful. Well, I think you succeeded in that, Jamie. I think it's a great work, and I also think it will stand the test of time. And it's very personal. You know, it's really, there's the fact that you're a young man as well, I think added a different quality to the way the book was written. I noticed it was sort of touching me in different ways from how it might have done if you'd written it in your 50s or 60s. So I think that adds a positive quality to it.
Oh, great to hear. And I probably should say I came at this point of view to say I'm not an expert in philosophy by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't really like the word expert at all because it implies that you've learned everything there is to be learned, and that will never happen. That will never be the case, no matter how old you are. I was writing this as I was feeling it, and there's still so much more that I'm trying to plumb the depths of from philosophy, but other multiple points of view. And, you know, it's great to always strive for something through philosophy, to have that forward momentum. And if I could just leave one lasting thought for people of this episode, it is philosophy is a great momentum driver. If you just follow a certain path and try to apply these ideas, I guarantee in small ways you'll start to notice the difference. The hard part is just being consistent, and that is the struggle. That is what philosophy is.
Yeah, beautifully said. So people can listen to this episode. Like sometimes people listen to episodes more than once because they pick up extra nuances. And even just doing that, which is a relatively passive way of taking in the information while you're driving to work, you know, or doing the laundry, or you can get the book. And just to remind people, you can find all Jamie's books on jamieryderbooks.com, JAMIERYDER books.com. So, Jamie, we've talked about an awful lot today, which I thought we probably would. I didn't know exactly what we would talk about. Has there been a favourite part of our conversation today for you?
I'll definitely be having the self-awareness that my partner thinks I'm an absolute nutter, for sure.
I thought that was... It's funny you said some of my favourite podcasters, apparently their wives or husbands just tell them to shut up at home if they start going on about it, which I think is quite balancing. It keeps us grounded, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. But, you know, I really appreciate your time, Catherine. This has been a great episode, just being able to be up on my soapbox for however long we've had. And I hope these ideas resonate with somebody. And even if they don't, at least it's opened up a pathway for people to see that there is something different out in the world to be curious about.
Yeah, 100%. And from my point, thank you for coming on. Thank you for writing the book, because I know it's not easy writing a book, and you had so much material to not include, you know, to sort of bring it into something cohesive. It's an extraordinary piece of work. So I just want to thank you for doing that. And someone can just buy it and just read it for however much, I don't know, 10 or 20 quid. And that's a great gift. Thank you for that. So everybody, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you've been watching, please put a comment below the video, because those are always great and people can respond to those, and I always respond. Do check out Jamie's website. Do get his book. I'll put the Amazon link in the show notes. And thanks again to Jamie Ryder.